Today I'm going to do a video on the table that I have constructed for my recently acquired DeWalt 790 radial arm saw. As you can see, the backboards were constructed using kiln-dried 2x4s, doweled and glued together. First of all, I milled them using a joiner and my planer to get them where they'd come out smooth. Really all I had to do after that, after gluing them up, was take a card scraper to the surface and everything was good. And I had to rip it to the right size, which I didn't do. I ripped this part an inch too wide and this side an inch too narrow. I may glue them back together and re-rip it, I don't know. That's the backboard. The table itself is constructed of 26 rippers from 9-ply 3/4 plywood that I purchased at the home store. It's a good grade of plywood, not the best, but good enough for this. I rip it lengthwise so that half of the plies are running the long way and half are running, or in other words, running the length of the table. And that gives this table a tremendous amount of rigidity. It's very easy to build. So I rip those and then anchor it to the table using 8 5/16 bolts that are put into these countersink holes, which when I made the countersinks, well, when I drilled the holes before making the countersinks, which meant I had to use a hinge dapping router bit in a hole, in a 1-inch hole I drilled in a piece of MDF in order to put in these holes, in order to put in the countersink holes. What's the other thing that's important? At this point, you're not trying, when you're installing this table, you're not trying to get it square to the arm. You want to get it parallel to the back of the radial arm saw frame down below. So I very carefully measured from the back to here on each one. You also want the blade, the table. This is another thing that I did very carefully. In my last video, this thing was not working too well, so you can see now how easy it. I mean, I can move it with one finger. I finally got that little gear put in the right place. So you put it on the end rip, tighten the yoke, and you don't have to tighten it that tight, come to find out, and move the end rip until it reads 0. All right, and at that point, right here, that will be the back of your table. All right. I went a little bit further because I'm not going to pay any attention to this rip gate. I went just a pinch further. Well, actually, I'm pretty close to right on. Which, if you get it just right, the back bolts will just, the center of the holes will be in about 3/4 of an inch from the back of the table. These holes right here will be in about 3/4 of an inch from the back of the table if you get the table in the right place relative to the blade on a 790. What it'll be on other saws, I can't tell you. All right, so that's important, that this table is now square to the base, not to the arm. We'll adjust the arm square to the table later. While I'm discussing this, let me show you something else I really like about this table, or this 790 saw. Well, let me just do it this way. Put that back. I have a very small shop. See how easy that moves now? Just a piece of cake. I have a very small shop, which means that I don't have a lot of workspace for doing assembly. So I've been doing assembly on top of my table saw, on top of this little platform I've got here, but I also do quite a bit of assembly on the radial arm saw itself. And this swings clear over out of the way, giving me a 28 by 48 work surface on which to do assemblies. That's going to prove out to be very, very handy. Where the Delta saws, the arm doesn't swing out of the way like this. You've always got this projection sticking out right in the middle of the assembly area, which makes it very difficult. Well, it doesn't make it difficult. It just limits how big of a thing you could assemble up here. And I could assemble something quite large on top of this table. So again, 3/4 9-ply plywood. There are other methods of doing it. This is my method. You glue them up, and then you joint them on your table saw or your radial arm saw to where you've got where this edge, where one edge is perfectly straight, all right? And then you rip the other edge on your table saw or radial arm saw to where it is perfectly parallel to the front edge. Of course, you cut it to length, the length that you want. I think I'm 47 3/4. Some guys trim the edges, make them real fancy. I'm not going to do that. I did on the last one, and it just seems like a waste of time to me. I mean, I'm going to put a sacrificial top of 3/8 plywood on top of this to preserve this, and I'll just route it off even with the edges. I don't see much point in prettying it up. It's a tool for me. It's not a work of art in that regard. So how did I glue this up? This is kind of important. Let me swing the camera around to this other table that I've got here. And you can see 2 bar clamps set up there. So I set it on top of these. I put the strips running the long way on this. Where is one? I've got a strip here somewhere. Right there. This is wider than what my rippers were. This is 3 inches. But I set them on like this and glued them up. What's important here, if you don't want to introduce a twist in this setup in your table, you've got to make sure that this bar and this bar are parallel. You do that, you treat these bars as if they're winding sticks, and you may have to shift one or the other up slightly to get them to run perfectly parallel. You just get down low and side across them. If you need to, you can put some white tape on one of them to where it'll show up against the black of the pipe. But you can imagine if this was this much out, how that would twist the tape. So these have to be parallel. And after you got them parallel, these bars are straight enough to where you're going to come out with a very flat table. I use Titebond 2, but I understand that Titebond 3 has a little bit more open time. You got 26 boards here that you have to glue up. I use a roller for my glue ups, which speeds things up. But if Titebond 3 is in fact gives you more open time, I wish I'd have had it because you're really kind of under the gun. You've got to get this thing glued up. Well, the glue is still liquid. I managed it, okay, but I wouldn't have had to rush quite so much with my clamps and everything if I'd have had Titebond 3, I don't think. Now, after you've got it glued up and it's sat for 3 or 4 hours, then you can remove all the clamps. All right. And then I use these 2 strips, the ones I just had here. These 2 strips, all right, All right, and I screwed one to each side of the table. And I'd constructed this sled. See the groove in it where the router cut the groove in it for me. All right. And then this router with a 1/2 inch bit that'll cut a flat bottom. Any dado bit will do that. And then you just slide this back and forth, move it, slide it some more. Took me about a half an hour, 45 minutes. All right. Now the important thing on this again is that you screw one of these boards on, but then you have to get down before you screw the other one on and side across them and treat them as windings. Paint the top of one black if you have to in order to get a good sight picture, because there again, if these two boards are not parallel with one another, you're going to introduce a twist. All right, so you don't want any twist. So I screwed this one on to where this board was stuck up and about a 1/4 inch above my table. All right, and then 1, 2, 3 screws, and then I put one screw on this end through to where this was about a 1/4 inch, and then I sighted this board and raised it up, or if I needed to, I raised this one up, put a small shim under it, shim them up to where they were parallel, and then screwed this side. Now I know that my board is going to be flat when I take it out of there, assuming these two boards are straight. And when I ripped my 1 5/8" boards, I made sure that I left the factory edge. So I got 2 factory edges up, and I checked them for straight. I put one against the other and make sure, edges to edges, and they were straight to each other. So I assumed they were straight, and they probably were. That's the other thing. That's about it for the constructing of the table. It just takes a while to route this off. And yeah, I missed a bump or two here that I missed a little spot, but that was easy to take off with a block plane. Just knock the bumps off, and then I took my half sheet sander to it and went over the top again just a little bit. I didn't care if it was perfectly smooth, as long as it was perfectly flat. Because I'm going to put a sacrificial top on top of it anyway. And in fact, there's a couple of places where I don't know if the cameras can see that or not. Maybe I can zoom in on that spot. But right here at my finger, that is down. This one board tapers off about a 32nd of an inch lower than the other boards around it. It gets flush over here, but it's a little low right here towards the end. There's a couple of other spots like that where there's a little low spot. One board is a little low right over in here. If I can find my hand, yep, there it is. One board's a little low right in here and here, but an occasional low board like that, I wasn't going to lower the router another 1/16 of an inch and take another 1/16 of an inch off of this, just because of a couple of low spots. It didn't seem to make sense to me to go through all that labor and plus remove more wood. I also did not plane the back side. All I did was where the bolts are is underneath. I set that jig on there. First I made marks of where the bolts were going to go, and then I just cut channels, 3 channels, 1, 2, 3 channels for the bolts. Let me zoom back out. There's 3 places where you have bolts. You have a row of bolts here, in the middle, and another row of bolts on the end. You got 3 here, 2 here, and 3 here. So all I did was create a channel from the back of the table to the forward, about, well, as deep as I needed to get it flat, which was about, oh, I don't know, 3/16 or yeah, about 3/16 of an inch deep, and set my router and made this groove, and this groove with the same setup, with this same setup right here, as I flattened the table on the other side, and then I bolted it down with 8 bolts. The table is still loose. I haven't adjusted anything yet. That comes next. It's still none of the bolts that anchor this table and L brackets to the frame are tightened yet. That's a different project. But that's about it. You need lots of, you need about, well, I'd say 6 or 8 clamps similar to this would be very handy, and glue and a saw to rip up your boards, and a router, and it doesn't take long. I think I spent about, altogether, making the table and the backboards, I think I spent about 2.5 hours. And so, so I hope maybe this was a little bit useful. Here's another tip I picked up on these saws. This saw has a key hole in it. Well, my keyhole, I don't have a key, yet this thing still works. Well, it turns out inside this keyhole, there's a little vertical tab. If you move it with the end of a small screwdriver to one direction or the other, it locks and unlocks this. So if you happen to buy an old saw and the buttons don't work, or you're looking at an old saw and the buttons don't work, and it doesn't have a key, if you got a pocket knife or a small screwdriver, you can move that little thing left or right and probably get the buttons to work just fine. Well, I hope this video was a little informative, if it's not too dislocated.